We hope you're all well and that you had a lovely July. We're really excited to be back here for the Dean's Book Review. My name's Elizabeth Kronk, and I have the pleasure of being the Dean of the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And I'm really excited to be here today with three amazing panelists who are joining me to talk about a really good book and a very timely book, The Black and the Blue by Matthew Horace, who is a law enforcement professional with many years of experience. And I really found the book incredibly educational. And we wanted to pick a book for July because police enforcement has been in the news and in social media quite a bit lately. And so we thought, because of the timeliness of this topic, that we would go ahead and pick it for this month's book club review. I'm joined today by three amazing panelists. So I'm going to just speak for a couple of minutes with some of my impressions of the book, and then I'm going to turn it over to them because they're the real experts on not just police enforcement, but also in criminal justice reform. So first we have with us Dean Shima Baughman. Professor Baughman is a professor of law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and she is also our newest associate dean for research and faculty development. So we're really excited to have her with us. She specializes in criminal law. And so she's going to have a lot to share. And then once Professor Baughman is done, we're going to have Marlon Lynch, who is our new University of Utah Chief Safety Officer. It's the first time that we've had a Chief Safety Officer at the University of Utah, and we're really excited that he could join us today. I think he's going to have some wonderful things to share. And also his life and his career have intersected with several of the individuals talked about in the book. So I think he's going to have some really wonderful stories and information to share with us. And last but certainly not least on our panel today is Judge Clemens Landau, who's with the Salt Lake City Justice Court. And although not necessarily an expert in policing and law enforcement, he certainly is being very forward and progressive in terms of criminal justice reform and in terms of systemic racism and how we can deal with that in our society. So I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. And the book was, again, really eye-opening to me. I learned a lot. And one of the reasons why we're really happy to have Judge Landau with us and to talk about these instances of how we have systemic racism and police are really kind of at the end of a broken system, because in the book, Matthew Horace talks about and gives several examples of where police are kind of the last line of a broken system, if you will. And so, for example, Kathleen O'Toole at page 65 of the book talks about this. And she was the first female chief of police for the Seattle Police Department, and she was the first female commissioner for the Boston Police Department. And she talks about how police are at the end of a failed system. At page 65, she says, "Unfortunately, as cops, we are at the tail end of failed systems. When our institutions fail to provide people with the things they need to survive, skills, jobs, resources, they become police problems. So if a community's education system isn't good, the people are living in poverty or not getting the mental health services they need, we are probably going to end up with an encounter with you." And by that, she's speaking from a police officer's perspective. Similarly, the book goes on at page 76 and 77 to talk some more about this idea that police departments do not operate in a vacuum and that they are reflective of their systems and their cultures. So Matthew Horace talks about, and he says at page 76, "Unfortunately, when such incidents do occur as police violence and things that the community may not respect in terms of policing, we look for answers almost solely inside police departments, divorcing the officers' actions from the political, community, and societal norms that underlie their actions." And at page 77, he goes on to say law enforcement does not operate in a vacuum. And he gives this really salient, I thought, example of Fred Watson from Ferguson. Now, I certainly was familiar with Ferguson from the Michael Brown murder, but I was not familiar about Fred Watson's story. And Fred Watson, at the time that the story starts, he's a successful individual with a high security clearance with the federal government, doing systems analysis, and he had come back to Ferguson to play basketball and to watch baseball because he grew up in the community and he wanted to come back to play and to participate in the community. And after he's played these games, he's relaxing in his car when a police officer pulls up and basically, long story short, ends up citing him with 5 citations initially, and then that grows to 7 to 8 citations. And he did absolutely nothing wrong. He was merely sitting in his car, and he just gets all of these citations. And the reason why the officer is first looking for somebody to give citations is part of a systemic problem with the Ferguson justice system at that time, because Ferguson was supporting itself with high fines. And so they were deliberately looking for people to give fines. And of course, this incident ends up really destroying Fred Watson's life, because as a result, he loses his security clearance. He's not able to pay for his children's schooling, so they have to go out of schooling and go to different schools. And it takes years for this to be resolved. And so even though this is a highly educated, sophisticated individual who's able to hire lawyers, the lawyers can't even work through the system in a timely manner in order to get these really bogus claims against him waived. And it takes years and years and years, and takes a tremendous toll in his life. And so I thought that was a really great and salient example, not great in terms of the impact to Fred Watson's life, but in terms of how the police were really the tail end of these policies that led to really disrupting people's lives. I also thought it was helpful because, of course, right now the Black Lives Matter movement is front and center in society. And I thought that Matthew Horace had some really good things to say about these movements and about criticism of law enforcement. At page 63, he says, "I thought about my fellow officers who are upset or feel betrayed about a movement that is directed at fighting against police. But my brothers in blue are wrong. The suspect has once again been misidentified. These protesters are not saying white lives don't matter or that police lives don't matter. Everything in America, from educational institutions to social networks, television, news, films, financial markets, says that white lives do matter. Instead, the message is a demand and a plea for society to embrace African Americans' humanity. Black lives matter too." And so I thought that was a really interesting, from a police officer or law enforcement professional's perspective, on movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement. The last thing that I'll say that really jumped out to me from the book, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panel, is this idea of being suspicious while Black, or suspicious and Black. There's a lot of discussion about that at the beginning of the book, about how individuals will, he would often, when he was a patrol officer, would get called that there was a suspicious Black male. And Matthew Horace would say, well, why is he suspicious? What is he doing? And he would be kind of critiqued for saying, well, what is he doing that's suspicious? And so Matthew Horace makes this argument that we need to move away from just assuming that somebody is suspicious for being Black. And this really was salient to me because in my own life, not in the current community that I live in, not since I've lived in Salt Lake, but in a past community, we had a neighborhood listserv where people could communicate. And I vividly remember one day, and we lived really close to a university, so students were oftentimes walking through our neighborhood. And the listserv, the neighborhood listserv, lights up about, oh, there's somebody who's Black with a book bag. There's a Black person, there's a Black man walking through the neighborhood with a book bag. And of course, my husband and I were thinking, well, yeah, we live right next to a university. I'm sure it's just a student going to school. But we were just so disappointed in our neighbors who assumed that because he was Black male and had a book bag, that he must be trying to steal something. And so I have very much personally seen that in my life. And Matthew Horace talks about that at page 13. He says, it's not that we shouldn't investigate suspicious people, but what makes them suspicious. If we have an inherent fear of or bias against Blacks, they're always going to be suspicious. And he goes on at page 17 to say, America is saying to us that it is officially reasonable to be afraid of a person just because he is Black. And because you fear him, it is okay for him to be killed. And then also at page 63, he goes on with this theme and says, whether unconsciously or intentionally, American society is suffused with racial bias that must be eradicated. And so I thought he did a really good job of making that point. And that's certainly something that I have seen in my own personal life and even in a neighborhood that I lived in. And I will say that was kind of the last straw. We're like, we don't want to be in this neighborhood anymore. And so we moved. But I think it's a good critique, and something that we can all be aware of is what makes somebody suspicious. And are you just thinking that they're suspicious because they're a Black man? So with that, I will turn it over to Dean Baughman for her thoughts on the book. Dean Baughman.
Hi, it's so great to be with you. Thanks, Dean, for picking this amazing book and inviting me to the panel. I've been studying police, race, prosecutors, violent crime for the last 10 years, and I'm happy to share some of my thoughts that I had while reading this book and kind of make some of the points that Matthew Horace made so well. First off, I just think it's important to note that we live in a really difficult time with a lot of racial tension. And I think finally the American population is at a sort of tipping point over violence, and particularly police violence. I think the recent killings, unprovoked killings of unarmed Black men have had a lot of Americans ready to, defund or abolish the police. And so it's important to hear from a voice of, a Black police officer to kind of try to see if we can find some kind of middle ground with police and what that middle ground is. I think, this, some of the points that he makes in his book intersect with some of the things that I've researched. And so I'd love to kind of go through 5 of those points. The first one, and before I do that, I think one question you might want to ask yourself as we're thinking about police and how to reform police, and this is, in the common media conversation, and I think that's probably why a lot of you are, at this book review, but one question I'd have you ask before I present some of my research on this is, what impact would abolishing police have? I mean, would it increase crime? Would it improve our situation? And, kind of just keep that in the back of your mind as I go through some of the thoughts. So one of the thoughts I wanted to talk about is the same one that Dean Warner raised, which is that the race issues, basically he said the wrongs of police don't begin and end with them, and that police have the same biases we have. So police are stricken with implicit bias just like we are. And as Dean Warner talked about the suspicious male, Black male example, it's difficult for us to get rid of these implicit biases that we have. And other scholars have written that because we live in a white supremacist society, these biases are with us. And so this is something that I've studied, and implicit bias is difficult to train away. So a lot of the trainings of implicit bias don't work. So if you're thinking, okay, let's give diversity training to police officers, and it often doesn't work. Some trainings that do work are procedural justice trainings, but anyway, so one of the thoughts to think about with what to do about implicit bias is, and something I've proposed in the past and has been successful with prosecutors, well, I guess we don't know successful, but it's been employed, is a kind of blinding. So we've seen bias with resumes, with people getting hired where, because somebody has a Black name, or it's clear that they're Black or a minority, they're less likely to get an RA job or another kind of job. And also with music tryouts, they've proven that, if you put a blinder on people, to not see that person, whether their gender or their race, it's more likely that there's not going to be bias against them. So we've thought about this principle, and my co-authors and I in 2015 proposed that what if we did this with prosecutors, right? The police can't have bias in arrest, but prosecutors can certainly have a blinding. I'm sorry, police can't have blinding in arrest, but prosecutors could potentially have blinding when they charge people. And so could we, put in a stopgap to this implicit bias that police and all of us naturally have? And right now, the San Francisco DA's office is attempting to do this. They're, kind of studying it to see if it works. And if it does, this could be an interesting model to roll out nationwide if it does reduce bias. So, one thought, that's just kind of one thought of how do we get rid of implicit bias? It's hard to get rid of, but can we do something to kind of stop us from making things worse with it? Another point, the second point that Horace makes that I wanted to emphasize is he made the point that cops are the guys who break up the family fight. And that's typically what police do. So to put it in context, police spend 80 to 90% of their time. And I'm excited to hear from our other panelists, Marlon Lynch, because he's been a police officer and you can talk about this. But a lot of the studies show that police officers spend 80 to 90% of their time doing kind of like social service functions, dealing with traffic flow, first aid, dealing with family fights, and about 10% or 15% of their time solving crimes. And so that's, I think, an important issue to keep in the back of your mind. And I want to talk about some of the results of that and what happens when police spend only 10% of their time solving crime in a minute. But I kind of also want to go through quickly a few of the issues, really important issues, and all of them could have a large conversation, but that Matthew Horace goes through in his book. He says, as far as the issues with police, there's not adequate training. And this is something a lot of scholars have noted. If police are doing social work functions, they're not trained as social workers and they have a gun. They're trained to do self-defense. And he gives some really poignant examples in his book of, where police misread situations where there isn't a threat, but they, could have easily escalated it with a threat. He also talks about them, using force that's unnecessary, where bad cops are transferred from one department to another. There's some studies about this as well. Also that blacks and whites see this issue differently. So the views of police of blacks versus whites is much different. And a lot of times it's based on their experience, right? The more violence against people of color and also less crime solving in those communities, which is something I want to show you some slides on in a minute. But his fourth point that I want to emphasize is that Horace says that police, and this is not just police, but police departments, see success as arrests and summons. So in order to measure the success or effectiveness of a police department, typically what you do is look at their arrest rates. And the second thing you look at is their clearance rates. So how many people did they arrest? And then of those, of the crimes that are presented to them, right, reported to them, how many did they clear, which means how many did they arrest and turn over to prosecution. This is a really tricky number, and I'm going to share with you some slides that I have here to show you kind of why clearance rates are so tricky. Are we okay on that? Can we see everything? Can everybody see that? Okay, I assume so, if no one's yelling at me. Okay, so the slide I'm showing you here is just giving you a sample of some of the problems we have with clearance rates. So clearance, as we talked about, is this number that police report to the FBI. This is something gathered nationally. And clearance rates, are really a number that can have a lot of kind of fraud, miscalculation, misclassification in it. And these are some examples that I point out here where, police departments misclassify arrests and say they cleared crimes when they haven't. I also want to show something else that I think is important in measuring, are police solving crimes? Are they doing their jobs? And what happens when police are spending 80% of their time, kind of fixing a family feud or getting cats from trees and all of that? Well, okay, so this slide will show you, this is the percentage of violent victimizations that are reported to police. So the thing to learn from this chart, and you can see the orange line is serious violent crime, is that 50 to 60% of serious violent crimes are reported to police. This isn't kind of a minor thing. We're talking about aggravated assault, robberies, rapes and sexual assaults, and murders. Well, actually not murders. Murders is but it's harder for people to hide murders, so they're on top of those. But and then showing you property victimization. So we have property crime in general. If you see the blue line, about 40% of violent or property crimes are reported to police. So pretty low there as well. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that you wonder, why are people not reporting crimes to police? And I think there's deeper issues as to why they're not. And a lot of the victim surveys say that people just don't think police can solve those crimes. And it's kind of true, right? So let's look at standard clearance rates. So this is how clearance rates are judged throughout the country. And, kind of overall, you can see the overall percent of crimes cleared, which means, crimes that occur that are reported to police, not the ones that actually occurred, because as we said, 40% of violent crimes are never reported to police, and maybe 50% of property crimes are never reported to police or more. But of the ones that are reported to police, only 21% are actually cleared, meaning sent to prosecution to be solved. And so we see, why people are not reporting crimes to police is because often police aren't clearing them. What I would call true clearance rates is, what is the true clearance rate? Meaning how many crimes actually were reported or not, reported to victim surveys, meaning they occurred, but they weren't reported to the police. How many crimes actually occurred, as far as we can tell, versus how many did police send to prosecution? Well, that number is about half, so about 10% or so. And you look at over the, those years that I post on the slide, about 10%. So people are not being completely irrational when they're not reporting crimes to the police. This one just gives you a good sense of the whole picture, right? So the blue line is known crimes. So how many crimes do we know about, meaning victim surveys? And then, the second one is reported crimes, then arrests and convictions. So as you see, the numbers kind of go down with each line, and particularly the reporting is a huge gap. And then the arrest is another huge gap. So we know that we're not succeeding necessarily as far as police solving crimes. And, a lot of the numbers kind of nationally show police spend maybe 4% of their time solving violent crimes, which is, I think, our perception. So something Matthew Horace talks about is our perception of police is that they spend a lot of time, getting bad guys. And there's a quarter of our shows that we watch on TV that are police dramas. And so, our perception is not really quite true to what they actually do. And I think he makes this point so well in his book that police are just kind of wandering around and, trying to do their best, but often they're not kind of targeted on solving crimes. Okay, so I want to show you one more, just a few thoughts I had. This is from an article that I got out recently, but so we know that police are not very effective at solving crimes. People turn to police when they're victims of serious crime only about half the time. Police are only able to arrest people on average about 10% of the time for those crimes committed. I think this lack of criminal accountability can have devastating effects, particularly on communities of color, right? Where most of the unsolved murders are of people of color, and also I would presume with other crimes as well, even though those are not studied as carefully. But something, I think we could do one piece of the improvement is, scholars and policymakers, we need to have a critical conversation about, how low these rates are where police are solving crimes. Do we care? Does it matter? And this is one of those things that, going back to the question I posed earlier, how much of a difference would it make to us if we abolished police, right? I think people think crime would go, unchecked, but crime is sadly already going unchecked. And so how, what do we do with that? I just think this is an important piece of the puzzle that we don't often think about is, okay, well, police are not spending a lot of time solving crimes. So is it possible for a social worker, an EMT, or others to fill in for some of those police functions that we right now have, armed police officers handling, possibly. And also, I'd point out, I think it's really important to figure out police departments, why reporting rates are so low, particularly in communities of color. And maybe that means we need to kind of approach punishment differently, right? Maybe people aren't reporting their friends because they don't want them to go to prison, but it might help to have, a social worker or somebody to mediate disputes and help people solve those problems. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, and then, I can give other thoughts in the Q&A, but I will turn the time now to Marlon Lynch, who has some awesome experience as a police officer.
Great, thank you, Shima. Thank you, Dean Cronk-Warner, for the invitation to participate. Definitely already learning some things from the previous comments, and definitely anxiously anticipating Judge Landau's comments as well. Just to quickly follow up, just a couple points that both you and Shima have made, and specifically talk about implicit bias. The impact of that overall, Dean Warner, the example you gave, that's the impact of the caller is influencing the police response with that. And so for the fact that we have a caller who has displayed some form of implicit bias, that's relayed to the responding police with that. And that's something that we've talked about and tried to address in training as well, even with our dispatchers who receive the initial calls, is trying to screen out that particular bias, just give, the circumstance and what's going on, and not have that early influence on the type of response with that. Shima, your comments regarding stats that you pointed out that Matthew Horace put into play. If you think about it, and as he refers to when he started in law enforcement, mid to late 80s, policing 90s on the street, specifically, that's, high crime rates, make arrests, put people in jail. Those are the stats that's driving it. He definitely is correct with that. And then if you look at some of the methodology, the broken windows theory with it, and what's heavily in play, which has been over the 90s, sort of originated in New York with NYPD with CompStat. That CompStat system has filtered throughout the US, started in major cities, and has filtered throughout, even in practice in higher ed for university police departments. And that's tracking the crime statistics and what the impact is. And you put all that data together to see how many arrests that you've made during a time frame, how many crimes have been committed during a time frame, including the clearance rates. And that's part of the performance. And so that is driving it. That is driving it on how you are, assessed. And so that was, great. This is sponsored by the law school. What do laws represent? They're social norms, right? And what society wants. That particular time, the 80s and 90s, it was driving down the crime rate. What we're experiencing now is the fact that these norms are changing in regards to what the expectation is of police, and it's not just all enforcement. And so I'll be curious to see over time how we continue to evolve and make some of those adjustments with that. And I just had this conversation regarding the social workers and police response, or instead of, and if you poll social workers, most of them don't want to respond without police with them. And that's because they know situations can change pretty quickly in how they're handling it. And so there are some that are fine without that. We hear some of the activists now say that the response should be completely instead of police, not having police present at all. But I'd be curious to hear the discussion from the social workers on how they would feel about that, because some of the models that are currently in place, the social workers are responding with police, and that is at their request in some cases with that. So, and that's something that we are actually in the process of developing here as well. So we've started to do some benchmarking with that information. So interesting with that. In regards to my thoughts on the book, and just real quick on my background, this is my 27th year in public safety. My experience, I started as a municipal police officer and then transitioned into higher education. My experiences have been in large metropolitan areas at universities that also had health systems that spread throughout the county or the state with that. And so in relating to this, my connectivity to it is Chicago's my hometown. Matthew Horace makes a pretty significant reference to some of the policing methods there. But then I was also at the University of Chicago and led the public safety department there during the time period that the Laquan McDonald incident occurred. And so I'll speak a little bit to that as well. But wanted to start just with, his chapter, Matthew Horace's chapter on being Black in blue. Being a Black man in law enforcement is not easy, specifically just in what it means, sort of the history of policing itself, and participating in a profession that has its issues with trust and credibility, but specifically has issues with underrepresented communities. And I've wanted to be in law enforcement for a very long time. It's not something that some people sort of fall into it. I planned for it and went to school for it. And my undergraduate degree and my master's degree are both in criminal justice with it. And my perspective is to be part of the change with it, and to be able to have that influence internally to push it out, and to have those experiences and apply it to what's needed in the communities that I serve. And that was my perspective on it, and continues to be with it. On page 30 in the book, a quote that he says, as a Black cop, it becomes part of your job to navigate this maze and serve differing cultures for the sake of the greater good. Wholeheartedly believe that statement. As I just reflect back on my career, I started with the police department in Michigan. Lansing, Michigan is the capital of Michigan. Annually, the Klan marches on the capital of Michigan. And annually, we would stand in July, August humidity in Michigan in full gear, protecting the Klan as they exercise their rights. As a 21-year-old, listening to the comments that are going on behind you from the people that you are protecting, and looking at the people that you are protecting them from, so to speak, and them looking like me, and the comments from both, from the Klan in regards to, that's right, N-word, do your job, or from, the Black community and the Hispanic community that's on the other side of that, questioning me and who I am for actually in that role. It's difficult. And this is a discussion that I've continuously had throughout my career with men and women of color that are in public safety, is that you're going to continuously be questioned on what you're doing. And the thing is that if you know what you're doing is the right thing, that's the important piece. But how do you bridge it? And having the conversations on both sides is extremely important. I found myself as a police officer, as I worked patrol and even in investigations, paying attention to how people of color were actually treated and how they navigated the criminal justice process with that, and not circumventing the system, but making sure that people are aware at each step what their rights are and what options are available to them. And even in some cases, in working with some of my colleagues on the street, letting them know what certain things meant. These Black males are responding to you this way because this is what you're doing that causes them to act and respond in a certain way. When you go into the household, here are some cultural differences that you need to be aware of with that. So trying to provide that education on both sides with it. I found myself in that. Page 40, he talks about being a police officer on patrol and going to a call for service. And when he arrives, the person says, "I asked for police officers, not N-words." Now, this is someone who's called for police service, and that's how they respond. That took me back to, that's happened on more than one occasion. I actually found most of my challenges were not necessarily for the men and women that I worked with. It actually came from the community that I was serving with that. And that is not unusual. I would venture to say that if you talk to people of color that are in law enforcement, they would tell you exactly, what most of their challenges come in is from those in the community they're serving. So for the fact that you've called and requested police service, and that's your response when someone comes that is obviously a police officer, you drive up in a police car, you're in full uniform, and that's the response with it. Much like Matthew Horace said, he didn't relay that to his supervisor. I got on the radio, called my sergeant, he showed up, explained that if you're going to receive service from this police department today, this is the person that you're going to receive it from. She said, "No, thank you," and closed the door with it. So again, it's an interesting perspective in regards to that. For Mr. Horace, when he talks about a murder in Chicago, he makes reference to a neighborhood or two neighborhoods, Washington Park and Hyde Park. And those are two South Side neighborhoods, both probably about 5 miles from downtown. Washington Park, just for context, is when the city of Chicago made its Olympic bid for 2016. That's where Olympic Stadium would have been built. So just to give you a sort of how large the park is with that. And that's the dividing line, so to speak, between Washington Park, which is a traditionally lower socioeconomically developed neighborhood, to Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago actually resides with that. And the population, if you look at demographics of Hyde Park, it's almost 50% white, which would be one of the largest populations of a white community on the south side of Chicago. Where the University of Chicago is within Hyde Park itself, if you were to look at a crime map to see where the hotspots are within the city, Hyde Park almost looks like a donut hole in comparison to the crime that occurs around it for Washington Park and some other areas with that. And when Matthew Horace talks about the impact of poverty and education, those two neighborhoods is just a great example in Chicago on the differences that actually has with that. That Hyde Park community is also where you have multi-million-dollar mansions. For example, this neighborhood where President Obama lived in Chicago. And then 4 blocks from there is one of the most violent street corners in the United States with that. And it changes very rapidly. But what is very clear within those neighborhoods are the differences in money, availability, and education, and how that education is impacted the surrounding areas with it. In his chapter that he titles The Cover-Up, on page 171, he talks about 2 men, one Craig Futterman and another is Jamie Calvin. Craig Futterman is a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. And Craig actually specializes in police accountability. And he was the chair of our independent review committee that we had there with that. Jamie Calvin is a freelance reporter who's also a community activist. Both played very key roles in the Laquan McDonald, I won't say investigation because the police department conducted the investigation, but as far as the information and making it known what actually had occurred there. Craig Futterman in his context had someone that had informed him specifically regarding video footage with that, and him and Jamie Calvin pursued it vigorously with that, and the impact of their roles in the whole Laquan McDonald sort of post-incident and what took place afterwards. Matthew Horace's depiction on it is very accurate with that and how that actually rolled out in regards to it. It was extremely interesting because as well as I knew the superintendent for Chicago Police Department at the time, Gary McCarthy, and the way that it came out, it was an extremely delayed response. It was also an election year in the city of Chicago, and Mayor Rahm Emanuel was the current mayor at the time. So there was a lot of speculation in regards to the cover-up itself. Was it covered up due to the fact that it was a mayoral election that was pending? Was it covered up due to the fact that it's another Black male killed in the city of Chicago? It was just a lot of the dynamics in that were, it sort of like all came to a head with that. And it was interesting from the perspective of someone who's in law enforcement with that, and looking at Matthew Horace on how he explains it. He is definitely connected into the facts of what's going on with that and the impact that it had on the city. There's also a documentary that came out, if you may have seen it, but it's called 16 Shots. I think it came on either HBO or Showtime, and it is about the Laquan McDonald shooting. So that would be another good follow-up for that. And then lastly, I'd talk about his chapter on damage control. Page 184, accountability has to be the rule of the day for the Chicago Police Department, and that has to happen regardless of who's chosen as the superintendent. The superintendent there is the chief of police. the fallout after the Laquan McDonald shooting was that the superintendent, Gary McCarthy, was terminated, dismissed. There was this national search. Ironically, the person that was appointed to lead it, her name is Lori Lightfoot. Lori Lightfoot is the current mayor of Chicago. The Chicago politics are just crazy, believe that. She was leading the search for this new superintendent. There was a committee that gave 3 finalists, 2 Black males, 1 white female, 1 internal candidate only. Those finalists were presented to the mayor. The mayor said, nope. He actually selected Eddie Johnson, who had not even applied for the job, and appointed Eddie as the superintendent for that. And again, you know, I guess it was an attempt at damage control, but it was the dynamics of that are just incredible, especially considering that Lori Lightfoot then became mayor. Eddie Johnson was the superintendent that she inherited. Lori Lightfoot then terminated Eddie Johnson last year for an incident that occurred with this, and just selected a new superintendent, external, David Brown, who used to be the former police chief in Dallas, with that. So it's just, you know, I guess I'm pretty impressed by Matthew Horace and his accuracy in how he's depicting all of this and the overall impact with it. But looking forward to the question and answering piece as well. I'm sure there's some interesting questions. And now I would like to turn it over to Judge Landau.
I got to make sure that I'm not the first one that starts talking with my mute button on. So I will breeze through this because I'm no expert on law enforcement. I think the title of this, after reading through the whole book, could just as well be A Cop Reveals the Crimes, Racism, and Injustice in America, full stop. That this isn't a problem with law enforcement. This is a problem with most, if not all, of our systems, especially our legal systems. And the system that I'm most involved in is the lowest court here in Salt Lake City. And I think that, again, is the court that's effectively at the tail end of failed systems. So if you are in a community and you want to, I think, make a difference, you can do what Marlon did, which is go be a police officer and really see that there's some good change made in those departments. And the next best thing is maybe go look out for your lower court and figure out what they're doing and figure out how to improve justice at that level, because it trickles up if you do that. And the one thing, and the thing that I keep repeating as a mantra from this book is, oh, everyone's doing page numbers because we're in law school here. So page 133, there's, you know, that when they're talking about the reform in New Orleans, the paragraph about how culture eats strategy for breakfast. And if you, and this happens at law firms, this happens at courts, I think it probably happens at law schools. If you don't know the how and why the people in your institution work, then you're not going to understand how it's possible to change the institution. So I think especially as lawyers, our gut instinct is to come up with a strategy and say, here's our hiring strategy. We're going to make bias in the legal profession go away. And you put that strategy in place, but it's out of touch with the culture of the institution that you're trying to change. And so the culture eats that strategy for breakfast, and you keep doing what you're doing. We've been, like I said, I want to keep it short. It's an amazing time to be practicing law right now because we're changing so rapidly in the last couple of months. Just in prepping for this, I was reflecting back on a book. It's called, I think, The Process is the Punishment. It was written about lower courts in the 70s, and it's remarkable how precisely it describes exactly what still happens at lower courts today. And because we inherit these legal systems and we kind of leave them intact and pass them along to the next generation. And right now we're in a moment where there's a lot of appetite for change because the judiciary is forced to change. And so this is, I would think, even though there are obviously great challenges with being a young attorney right now, this is a time of where you can use your imagination a lot more than any other time in the last, long time. Because there was another quote that I've passed over a couple times now, and that's kind of just with respect to the legal profession. If you took someone that was a good, decent lawyer in 1900, 1905, you could probably sit them down and give them a primer on how to practice law right now. And within a short amount of time, they'd be able to figure it out, because it hasn't really changed that much. And I think now, and it bakes in a lot of injustice. It bakes in some systemic racism, some structural problems. And we're in a point now where we can reimagine a lot of those systems, which I think is pretty exciting. But I think I'm running over. So why don't we get to the Q&A? What do you think, Dean Kronk-Warner?
Absolutely. Okay, so now we have about 12 minutes left for questions. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. So if you go ahead and type your question in, I can ask that of our panelists. Also, you'll see there's a thumbs up button in the Q&A. So if somebody has already asked your question and you want to push it up in the queue, you can do that with your thumbs up. So it looks like Victoria Vincent, and Victoria, it's good to hear from you again. Glad you could join us today. She asked, how does education play a role in police problems? Do you think an increase in required education would help the current police, such as bachelor's degrees? Any thoughts on this one?
I would love to answer that one just briefly, and I'd love to hear others' thoughts. But one of the things I've noticed, so in my last 10 years of teaching, I always have an officer come talk about search warrants, and something that particularly in Salt Lake City, the officers in the last couple of years have noted is that the pay for police has gone down dramatically. So they're not able to recruit people with bachelor's degrees or other advanced degrees as they used to. And so typically I have anyone, but it's typically a guy, but they always say, oh, we need more money for police officers so that we can have better educated ones. And I think it could help with some of the issues we have going on. And that's what they have said to me. So just my thought.
Yeah, from a recruiting perspective, it is tough, and with that people with bachelor's degrees coming in with it. Although I'll speak specifically within campus policing, I have seen that to be beneficial for the fact that they, in most cases, usually have the experience of having been a student. It helps them to understand the community, the primary community that they're serving with that, to understand sort of the college life and campus life and how that impacts you with that. From that perspective, I have seen that as well. I would think also from the requirement of a bachelor's degree, from, I guess, if you're looking for a standard to have had some form of ability for decision making and processing and things like that, and that could be beneficial as well with that. But I'd be curious what the research would actually show on those departments that require a bachelor's degree, if they've actually seen a difference in comparison to those that would not.
Great. Our next question says, I was struck by how many persons with mental illness that police are expected to deal with. This is chapter 13. How can we expect officers to deal with all those issues? Do you have any suggested solutions?
Wow. I think there was a comment earlier about, the training levels of police and being not necessarily being trained with that. The past few years, crisis intervention training and other types of training have been implemented. And those are usually, at max, maybe about 40 hours worth of training with that. And that skill set is also a deterrable skill. If you don't use it that often, it can go away with it. It's also a comfort level. And I continuously point out the fact that we actually have professionals who, specialize in mental health and different things like that, that those are the ones that are going to be better suited for it. Initially with police, that training was given as a tool to assess the needs of those that you are interacting with and then refer on. What has happened, the expectation or sort of the circumstances had dictated that you now assess it, and now actually you're expected to handle it and deal with it. And some of that is because some of those social services are not available at 2:00 in the morning on a Sunday or a Saturday and different things like that. And so police are the ones that are readily available and can respond to it. And so it's almost by default that has actually occurred. But those are specific enough, that is special enough to where those services need to be rendered by those that actually are more than capable to do it, and not just have been sort of received training as an assessment tool or just a response. It needs more than just a response. And there are some police officers, we have a couple here actually who have master's degrees in social work, but that's 2 out of 70 or so, right? So those are not the 2 that are responding all the time. And so, you know, the latest trend has been to partner with social workers to provide that service. And I think we'll start to see more of that going into place. But it's not something that police can handle alone, because that's really just not what they're trained to do.
Just a quick comment on that, looking at it with a bird's eye view. So right around the time when the war on drugs and the war on crime happened from the 60s to the 80s, and we started incarcerating a lot more people, we also cut our mental health services and our police force. And so we have this kind of, influx in prisoners and people that are troubled, and then also less police to deal with it and less mental health resources. And so really what we are using is police and prisons to deal with a large mental health issue, and something that's completely underfunded to deal with. So I don't blame officers for having the difficulties that they have with mental health issues, because they are under-resourced in that department.
And to piggyback on that, legal systems suffer from the same problem. So our court is, hasn't had a good strategy for populations that are underserved, that, the people facing homelessness come to mind. Most of those do have some struggles on the mental health front. And our court model isn't that great at handling that. We do have another model that John Baxter developed out at Homeless Court, where there are social workers involved. There's a social worker there by the name of Kim Russo, who has a really good overview over a lot of the homeless clients that we have. And that's a much more successful way of resolving cases for people in that community than having to come to court and sit for a few hours, which, by the way, isn't a great model for anyone, but it's particularly not good if you're homeless. And then getting a sentence that is something that you can't do. So I think we're also trending in that direction. I think our public defenders are using more social workers. Our law enforcement partners are using more social workers, and I think increasingly we're going to turn to more social workers as we try to figure out what's the clearest connection between this person and recovery, so that they can kind of get out of the churning cycle that they're in with their 10 or 15 lower court cases a year.
So unfortunately we're at 8:55, so I think this is going to be our last question, which is, in light of the violence perpetrated by police, particularly involving persons of color throughout the country, how should we respond to the movement to defund police departments?
I can speak to that first. Oh, go ahead, Marlon.
No, go ahead, Shima, please.
Okay. I just think we need to think about it seriously. I think on first blush, you think that's crazy to defund police. But if you think about what it might lead to, it's something to think about. So my ideal world would be where we fund police properly to solve crimes, and then have other departments, social work, emergency services, and them dealing with the 80% of the stuff that police do, the traffic people. So I think, defunding police, in a sense, meaning distributing the funds of police to other departments to deal with, of people that are specialized to deal with the particular issue at hand. So, you call in on a first aid issue, the police don't come out. We have an ENT come out, that kind of thing. So specialization, but also we do need to think that we do need to fund our police more to help solve crimes. They're not solving crimes. It's leading to a lack of reporting and a lack of safety and trust of police in communities of color, which is a problem itself. And a lot of victims go unserved. I think about 20 million victims a year go unhelped of crimes. So I think we do need to keep funding of police, but shift duties.
Oh, Marlon, you're on mute.
I got to judge. It was me. I think, defining defund is key with it as well, because, you hear it sort of used synonymously with other things as well. So reallocate, I understand. That sort of goes along with what Shima was saying, is, you know, if there's going to be reallocations of funds for more specific services that had sort of been allocated within the police budget, then that's fine. But the truth of the matter is most police departments, 80 to 90% of the budget is for staffing. So when you start talking, when you look at the actual budget composition, what does that mean? And the other 10 to 20%, maybe some operational things for equipment, training, different things of that nature. So knowing the composition of the budget, I think, is just as important. And so I think it's not as simple as saying take X number of dollars away from it. You examine the budget. How do you identify what that level, what those services are, and sort of in comparison to that particular budget, and remove it? I do think that there should be some sort of reallocation or resources that go back into the social services for certain with that. And if you're saying that because police appear to be doing the job, then take a percentage of that. But I think you sort of just, you know, be aware of unintended consequences as well that come with that.
Okay, well, we are at the top of the hour, and so unfortunately we're out of time. I think based on the number of questions that we have still in the queue, we probably could have talked about this for another hour. It's obviously a really important topic, but I do want to thank our panelists for taking time today to meet with us to share their thoughts on this question of policing and also systemic racism and injustice that we may have in our broader systems, including our justice systems and the systems that we as lawyers participate in. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everybody who was able to join us today. We really appreciate your time, and we will be back next month in August to talk about bystanders and how bystanders enable crimes and abuse in our communities. Thanks so much, everybody.